Welcome to Ride High Cowboy, the podcast that brings you the true crimes of Wyoming. So without further ado, let's saddle up and take a historical ride through the Old West. The murder of Ellen Watson sparked outcry from local ranchers throughout Wyoming. It was the first and only woman to be lynched in the state, but by far not the only cattle rustler. Her death sparked what would be known as the Johnson County War. The first of many cattle rustlers to die at the hands of the wealthy cattle baron's hired gunmen, Ellen Watson, or Cattle Kate as she came to be known at the hands of her murderer, died in 1889, suspected of stealing her neighbor's cattle. Later that same year, the Range Wars of Wyoming began. The Homestead Act allowed for hopeful folks to apply for a land claim at no cost, with the stipulation of improving the land within 5 years of the claim being awarded. Improvements including housing, farming, and ranching were its main draws. It was the only way for the government of the time to incentivize people to move into the wide open plains and grow the country. It brought all kinds of people into the unforgiving Wyoming landscape, a place consumed by dry, windy heat in the summer and relentless blowing snow in the winter. A lack of rainfall in the region made life more than difficult and sparked many feuds over water rights. Herds of cattle and acres of crops died, leaving hopeful homesteaders left with barren land and empty stomachs. Some prospered beyond their wildest dreams, leaving the legacies in the towns they helped create, while others died nameless in heaps of rotting cattle carcasses. It was no place for the weak of heart, mind, or body. In the earliest days, most of the Wyoming land was public domain, and many ranchers would let their cattle graze on the open land. The cattle were branded with specific markings to each rancher to show ownership, and when spring came around, the cattle were herded up and separated based on their brand. The new calves would be branded just like their mothers, and occasionally a stray calf was branded incorrectly, but that was a risk the ranchers were willing to take. One loss here and there wasn't a huge loss to anyone, and the ranchers worked together and helped one another. It was the only way to survive the rough lives they were living in the hope of fortune. But as more and more newcomers moved in, that community and camaraderie diminished. The climate was tough and resources were limited. Every new homestead and every new ranch meant less water, less grazing land, and less profit for the ranchers who came before. Concerns arose, and many of the larger cattle companies and ranchers decided they needed to do something. 24 of the largest outfits gathered to create the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. While the intentions of the association sounded good on paper, they ultimately began implementing rules and requirements that would prevent the smaller ranches from continuing, while ensuring the largest ranches grew. Requirements for expensive brand applications and approvals prohibited people from the ability to brand their cattle, proving ownership, and any unbranded calf would become the property of the association. The open range began becoming monopolized by the association, as well ensuring the water and grazing resources fell to the members of the association, leaving other ranchers with no way to maintain their herds. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, known as the WSGA, gathered frequently in Cheyenne, the state capital, although their ranching outfits ran through much of the state. The WSGA was comprised of some of the wealthiest men in Wyoming, and where there's money, there's power. The WSGA positioned themselves to greatly sway local and regional politics and eventually became the main agency of overseeing the cattle industry in the state. They organized new cattle shipments into the region and employed detectives to investigate reported cattle thefts and other illegal activity. By the 1880s, cattle theft had become an increasing threat, and with the influx of new homesteaders arriving in the area, it was becoming more difficult to identify the thieves from everyone else. There was no way of knowing who had come here to build a better life and who had come here to take it away from someone else. The Wild West was getting wilder, and life was becoming more difficult for everyone. Between 1886 and 1887, a series of harsh blizzards and negative 50-degree temperatures wiped out thousands of cattle, as well as the ranchers themselves. The wind-blown snow covered the prairie to the point that the cattle couldn't reach the grass underneath. A hot and dry summer followed, taking thousands more and nearly devastating the community. The WSGA took charge by enacting the Maverick Act in the Wyoming legislature. A maverick was an unbranded calf, and this act stated that all unbranded cattle now belonged to the WSGA. With many ranchers unable to afford a brand application or receiving multiple denials when they could, thousands of cattle were left unbranded and therefore were claimed by the WSGA in annual roundups. The WSGA also held a tight grip on Wyoming's stock interests by limiting the number of ranchers who could take part in these annual cattle roundups, leaving many small ranches with no way to claim their cattle. Members of the WSGA also did not allow their own employees to own cattle in order to reduce any additional competition, as smaller ranchers were pushed out of the state and cattle barren herds and wealth grew enormously. When competition became too high, some cattle barons would allege rustling to push the scales further in their favor. Although the cattle barons held the majority of the wealth, the smaller homesteaders outnumbered them greatly, and after years of being pushed around, they banded together to bring them and the WSGA down, but for the most part were unsuccessful. By the late 1880s, the WSGA began battling the growth of newly formed organized groups of cattle rustlers. Men realized the strength in numbers and born well-armed outfitters of cattle thieves throughout Wyoming. As one group fell, another was right behind them to pick up where they left off. These groups began creating their own hideouts throughout the state, with the infamous hole-in-the-wall cabin, which still stands today, being the main place for cattle rustlers to hide out between raids. Sheriff and WSGA detective Frank Canton made it his mission to find and eliminate these criminals from Wyoming. He was good at what he did and bore himself a reputation as a very lethal gunman. He had come from Texas and was known as a merciless, congenital, emotionless killer. The murder of Ellen Watson in 1889 sparked public outrage. Many of the smaller ranchers were furious at the events that took place and the state's inability to hold anyone accountable for the heinous act. After watching the WSGA use their power and force to kill who they thought was an innocent woman, they decided to fight back. George Henderson, the WSGA range detective who had worked together with Albert Bothwell to accuse Ellen Watson of cattle rustling, was murdered near Sweetwater Creek in October of 1890. In retaliation, the cattle barons tightened their controlling grip and began systematically hunting down any rancher who spoke out against them. Anyone who raised a hand to the cattle barons found themselves at the wrong end of the rope. Tom Wagner, a horse trader from Newcastle, Wyoming, spoke out against the WSGA publicly and often. He was hanged in June of 1891. Tom's friend Jimmy, who had previously been arrested for cattle rustling, was also murdered, and this was just the beginning. WSGA range detective Tom Smith killed a suspected cattle rustler, likely at the direction of his employer. And when indicted on murder charges, the WSGA gathered their political connections to secure his release. This infuriated the ranchers, as it seemed that no matter how hard they fought against them, the WSGA was too powerful to fall. Regardless of if they were criminals or not, there was no trial, and the WSGA found themselves the executioners. At this time, the WSGA's control over Wyoming range became undisputed, and it seemed that there was no end in sight. Any prominent competitor of the WSGA or its members found themselves hanged, and there wasn't a powerful enough group to stop them. Times were bleak for anyone outside their inner circle, but a light was about to shine through the tunnel. In 1892, a group of small ranchers joined together to create the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association, or the WFSGA, to compete against the WSGA. The NWFSGA was headed by Nate Champion. The WSGA immediately identified this new group as a threat, and to cut them off at the knees, blacklisted this group from the upcoming roundup and ordered the WFSGA to disband. Nate, being solid stock from a long line of ranchers and the son of a Texas sheriff, held his ground and publicly refused to disband. To really rub salt in the wound, he also announced the group's plan to hold their own roundup later that spring. And that was it, the spark that lit the fuse on what would come to be known as the Johnson County War. No rancher was safe, and everyone was out for blood. The WSGA put their resources together and, deciding collectively to keep their hands clean, hired an assassination squad of gunmen to kill Nate Champion on November 1st, 1891. Nate and his friend Ross Gilbertson were asleep in their cabin near the Powder River when the group of hired guns made their way inside. The cabin was small and only allowed for 2 of the gunmen to fit inside, so 4 others waited outside by the door. Nate, awoken by the commotion, instinctually reached for his pistol and a bloody shootout ensued. Nate shot and killed the 2 hired gunmen, while the other 4 fled the scene. Nate emerged unharmed, aside from some powder burns to his face from his pistol. The names of the hired gunmen were soon shared with 2 additional ranchers, who were ultimately ambushed and murdered before they could tell their tale. The small ranchers and farmers in the area were outraged by this, fueling the fire. The WSGA was unfazed by this setback. Frank Walcott, the leader of the WSGA and prominent rancher in North Platte, used his resources to hire additional gunmen with the intention of breaking up the NWF-SGA under the guise of persecuting cattle rustlers. It was at this time that the other prominent men in the state began taking sides in this war. Acting governor and surgeon Amos Barber, originally from Pennsylvania, and an acting surgeon in the U.S. Army until he moved to Wyoming to run the Wyoming Stock Growers Association's hospital, stood by the WSGA and blaming the small ranchers for the increase in criminal activity in the state. Indian War veteran and sheriff of Buffalo, Wyoming, William Angus, stood with the ranchers and homesteaders, believing that the cattle barons were abusing their power. It had become a clear war of the classes. By March of 1892, the cattle barons sent agents from Wyoming to Texas to recruit additional gunmen. They were tired of the ongoing battles and were ready to finish this war once and for all. Their goal was to eliminate the homesteaders, and this group of men became known as the invaders. The cattle barons, who had been known for hiring gunmen from Texas to do their bidding when it came to cattle rustlers and any other annoyances that would arise. John Baker recalled an instance of these invaders killing 9 trappers whom they had mistaken for cattle rustlers in Big Dry Creek, Wyoming. The cattle barons paid the invaders $450 as a bonus for their deaths. 23 gunmen from Paris, Texas, and 4 additional cattle detectives were hired by the WSGA and arrived in Wyoming in 1892. Some wealthy and prominent Wyoming men also joined the cause, including State Senator Bob Tisdale, State Water Commissioner W.J. Clark, as well as William Irvine and Hubert Teschemacher, who had both been instrumental in the organization of the state of Wyoming 4 years prior. Ed Taus, a reporter for the Cheyenne Sun newspaper, and Sam Clover, a reporter for the Chicago Herald newspaper, joined Surgeon Charles Bingham. Sam Clover would later recount the story to the eastern states, bringing knowledge of this war to the rest of the U.S. The total of 50 men were organized and were led by Sheriff Frank Canton, who had a list of 70 Wyoming residents to be either shot or hanged. The 23 men from Texas would be paid $5 per day, with a $50 bonus for every cattle rustler they killed. There was no proof of crime needed to receive the bonus. Today, that would be worth $1,732 for each man that they killed. This group, previously known as the Invaders, was now known as Walcott's Regulators. The men arrived in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and traveled by train to Casper, finishing their journey to Johnson County on horseback. Along their ride, they cut telegraph lines to prevent any alarm from being transmitted. During this ride, Frank Canton and the gunmen took the lead, while WSGA officials, led by Walcott, followed safely behind. The first name on Frank's list was Nate Champion, the man who had previously killed 2 hired gunmen sent to kill him 5 months prior. Nate was working at the KC Ranch, and on the night of April 8, 1892, Frank Canton and his men quietly surrounded the buildings. They stayed there until the next morning, waiting for Nate to merge. Nate and 3 other men who were staying at the cabin at the ranch that night, and as the sun rose and 2 men left the cabin to gather water from the nearby Powder River, they were captured by Frank and his man. The 3rd man was shot in the doorway of the cabin. As the gunman fired on the cabin in an attempt to kill Nate, Nate dragged his companion from the doorway back into the cabin. That man died hours later, leaving Nate to fight off the gunman alone. Nate held the men off for several hours more and was said to have killed 4 of Frank's gunmen and injuring another 3. A passing settler, Jack Flagg, along with his stepson, were seen by the gunmen and, being recognized as one of the men on Frank's list of names, were shot at. Jack and his stepson barreled down the path to get away from the gunmen. Jack fired back at them with his rifle and was able to get away, but lost a wagon in the process. As Nate sat in the cabin, a lone survivor of the ongoing standoff, he began to write down his final thoughts. His journal states, "Boys, I feel pretty lonesome just now. I wish there was someone here with me so we could watch all sides at once. Well, they have just got through shelling the house like hail. I heard them splitting wood. I guess they're going to fire the house tonight. I think I will make a break when night comes, if alive. Shooting again. It's not night yet. The house is all fired. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." Frank and his gunmen continued to shoot at the log cabin while others set it on fire using the wagon they had taken from Jack Flagg. Nate signed his letter and placed it in his pocket before making a run for it. He held his pistol tight and made way through the door, and he was shot dead. A note was pinned to his body, now riddled with bullet holes, as was the cabin, that stated, "Cattle thieves beware." Jack Flagg was able to make it to Buffalo, Wyoming, where he reported what he had encountered. Sheriff William Angus had had enough of these cattle barons and their gunmen. He was able to gather 200 men, many of whom were war veterans of the Civil War, within 24 hours. They made their way to the Casey Ranch on the night of April 10th, 1892. In the early morning hours of April 11th, the WSGA members and their gunmen made their way towards Buffalo in a continued show of force. They were determined to show the state once and for all that cattle rustling would not be tolerated, and anyone who wanted to stand against them would be shot down with no mercy. However, they received word that the horde of men waiting for them was ready and willing to fight. The WSGA, aware that they were outnumbered and unlikely to win, took safe haven in the nearby TA Ranch outside Crazy Woman Creek, where they encountered Sheriff Angus and all of his men. Sheriff Angus and his men reached the TA building where the WSGA men were huddled in one of the buildings. The sheriff's men surrounded the ranch, taking cover and killing the WSGA's horses to prevent them from escaping. One of Sheriff Angus's men rode to nearby Fort McKinney to obtain a cannon, but was turned down, while another attempted to build his own, but was unsuccessful. The men built a large bullet-resistant wagon with the help of a blacksmith to carry men closer to the building that the WSGA was staged in, so that dynamite could be thrown within the building. Mike Shonsey, one of the WSGA members, was able to escape the building he was holed up in and make his way to Governor Barber, who made every attempt to save the WSGA members. On April 12th, Governor Barber telegraphed United States President Harrison pleading for help, but the telegraph was never received. Wyoming Senator Joseph Carey and Francis Warren were notified of the situation in Wyoming and woke the president to inform him of the insurrection currently taking place in Johnson County. Immediately, the president ordered Secretary of War Stephen Elkins to address the situation under the president's order of domestic violence. The 6th Cavalry at Fort McKinney in Buffalo, Wyoming, was ordered to the TA Ranch to take charge of the situation. The 6th Cavalry took the WSGA members and the gunmen into custody on April 13th, turning the gunmen over to the local authorities and taking Wolcott and his WSGA members to Fort McKinney and then escorting them to Cheyenne, Wyoming. A total of 45 men, 45 rifles, 41 revolvers, and over 5,000 rounds of ammunition were transported to Cheyenne, with Governor Barber's undelivered telegraph to the U.S. President being printed on the front page of the New York Times on April 14th, followed by first-hand accounts of the siege. The story was also reported in the Chicago Herald as well as other East Coast newspapers. Ultimately, the WSGA members were held at Fort D.A. Russell, now known as F.E. Warren Air Force Base, where they were able to roam the base freely with the promise that they'd return each night. This preferential treatment was not taken well, and as the Johnson County attorney began to build his case, officials in Johnson County seethed at the preferential treatment. The New York Times reported that Wolcott and his men would be charged with aiding and abetting the invasion after having found Frank Canton's list of 70 men to be killed, a list of houses they had burned, and the payment contract to the Texas gunmen. However, in good old boy fashion, the WSGA members were never charged. The cattle barons used their wealth and high-power connections to ensure that no member of the WSGA was held accountable for their part in the Johnson County War that left so many dead. All of the gunmen were released on bail and told not to return to Wyoming for the trial. Most of them left Wyoming and returned to Texas, where they disappeared into the wind. On May 9th, U.S. Marshal George Wellman, a gunman who took part in the war on the side of the WSGA, was ambushed and murdered on his way to Buffalo, Wyoming. It was an act committed by the locals, still reeling from the lack of accountability and consequences for the WSGA members. He was the only marshal to die in the war. Another act of rebellion by angry locals occurred when a group of men set fire to the post exchange and planted bombs within the barrack of the 6th Cavalry as a response to what they had perceived to be influence of the WSGA on the local military, in part due to the leisurely way the WSGA members and their gunmen were treated while being held at the base. In response, the 9th Cavalry, of what was known as Buffalo Soldiers, was relocated from Nebraska to Suggs, Wyoming, to replace the 6th Cavalry and get a handle on the locals' rebellion. Within 2 weeks, the Buffalo Soldiers arrived and created Camp Benton's. This was received poorly, as seen by the increasing violence from the locals, and resulted in a massive shootout that pushed the 9th Cavalry right back out of town. 20 soldiers returned to the town to exact their revenge on the locals. In the fight, 1 soldier died and 2 more were injured. 2 more groups of soldiers arrived after the bloody battle, and the locals allowed them to investigate the incidents, but no charges were ever filed. After 2 more deaths related to the tensions within the town, the Army removed the 9th Cavalry in November of 1892, but the killings didn't stop. WSGA gunman Phil Dufresne disappeared later that year, which was never investigated. Also that same year, 2 alleged horse wrestlers were gunned down by the WSGA range detectives. No charges were ever filed due to the assistance of Otto Frank, a local rancher who had joined the side of the large cattle ranchers and the WSGA. In mid-1893, Nate Champion's brother came to Wyoming looking for work. Dudley Champion, while entering town, had come across Mike Shonesy's ranch. Shonesy, for unknown reasons, but most likely the similar appearance to his brother, took his rifle and shot Dudley on the spot. The coroner ruled it self-defense, and Shonesy was acquitted of the murder. Prior to his death, Dudley had traveled to Wyoming and met Shonesy 1 year before his brother's death near Beaver Creek Canyon. The two had a heated argument as Dudley had assumed Shonesy was one of the 5 men who had attacked his brother at his cabin. This interaction is believed to be what sparked Shonesy to kill Dudley the following year. Mike Shonesy left the country before the investigation was finalized. Dudley Champion was the last person to die in the Johnson County War. When all was said and done, it's approximated that 40 people were killed during the Johnson County War. It was a clear picture of the Wild West that was Wyoming in the late 1800s. There was a clear line in those days of the haves and have-nots, with only gunpowder separating the two. The Johnson County War has quietly been forgotten, with the names of those who fought and died fading into the stone monuments left for them to be remembered. However, the reason for that war lives on today. Water rights, land use, and the money and power that controls those from the shadows are still fought for, though without the guns and firepower that rang through the small towns and ranches that built our state. The small local ranchers who took their anguishes into their own hands, and the large cattle barons who fought for what they believed was theirs. Both sides held firm beliefs in what they deserved and fought hard for their livelihoods. Without them, Wyoming would not be what it is today, a people of strong stock and fierce convictions. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association still operates today, a testament of Wyoming's roots, grown in the blood of those who gave their lives to a fight that no one won. Did the WSGA start a war for their members' own greed? Or was it a valiant fight against the epidemic of cattle theft that threatened the livelihoods of those who had worked hard to build their fortunes? Were the locals who died at the hands of the cattle barons' extended trigger fingers engaged in stealing livestock? Were they hardened criminals who threatened the growth of every ranch in the state? Questions of right and wrong drift through the air with no answers. Though many tall tales have come from this event, few facts about the individuals involved are known. So who won the war? No one and everyone. As a sixth-generation Wyomingite, I thank both sides for their contributions to the place I call home. Good or bad, Wyoming would not be what it is without both sides of the coin building its foundation. Thank you for listening. I'm Blue, and this has been one of the many stories from Ride High Cowboy.